welcome to day 4 of missions. So if you remember yesterday, right, this whole week, we've been talking about Adoniram and Ann Judson, right? They are the first American missionaries to go overseas, and they are serving in Burma. So at this time, Adoniram is working really hard at translating the Bible into Burmese, but also, do you remember the end of yesterday? We heard that there were rumors of war happening between the British and Burma. So one night, as Adoniram and Ann are sitting down for dinner, they hear a loud knocking at the door. Bang, bang, bang! And in come 10 Burmese men with tattoos on their faces that were signs to represent that these were some pretty serious criminals who were now in charge of the new criminals. They were the guards. And they came with a book that had Adoniram's name on it. And it said that he was being arrested. He was going to be taken to the death prison because they were accusing him of being a spy for Britain. There was no trial. There was no opportunity for Adoniram to say that he was innocent. The king had declared him guilty. And so these men grabbed him, bound his arms, and dragged Adoniram away. At the prison, they fastened 3 heavy shackles around his ankles, and they threw him into a dark, windowless cell that was filled with disgusting smells of disease and decay, and about 50 prisoners were crammed inside, including his friend Henry and a sea captain, Scottish sea captain. The Burmese prisoner quietly warned them that other foreigners had been tortured and killed in this death prison. And after only a few short hours in this suffocating, stinky cell, the men hoped that death would come sooner than later. But at night, things got even worse. The guards lowered a long bamboo pole from the ceiling, and they locked all of the prisoners' ankle shackles to this pole, and then lifted the pole about 4 feet off the ground. The prisoners had their ankles dangling from the pole and only had their heads and shoulders touching the ground. So sleep became almost impossible. And in these long hours of darkness, Adoniram's mind kept drifting to Ann. Shortly before he was arrested, they found out that Ann was pregnant and she was going to have another baby. But would Adoniram ever meet this child? And was Ann even safe? And what about all the Bible translating that he had done? What was going to happen to that? Was this whole missionary trip for nothing? But then 2 days later, Ann arrived. And she brought food. And for the first time in the prison, Adoniram was able to eat because the death prison did not provide food. Any prisoner was completely dependent on helps from friends or family, or else they would starve to death. And Ann was only allowed to stay for a few minutes, but she came again and again, refusing to abandon him or the other foreign prisoners. Ann also knew that their home would probably be searched and destroyed, but before it happened, she hid their most precious possession. She hid the Bible translations. At first, she buried them in the garden, but later, she decided to hide it inside of a pillow. And so she made sure the pillow was yucky and gross and bumpy and lumpy because she wanted to give it to Adoniram, but she didn't want the guards to try to take it from him. So also, because of Ann's friendship with the government officials and her persistence, the men were able to be moved from that super gross cell into these little huts outside. And so even though they were still in a death prison, they now had sunshine and fresh air. Every night, they still had to go back into their cell and have their legs hoisted up into the air. But to survive these endless days, Adoniram and his friend Henry created this really interesting kind of chess set. And they would play chess out of broken pieces of bamboo on this old piece of cowhide to help pass the time and to focus their minds on something else, because Ann's visits starting to get less and less, and she was coming fewer because she's about to have a baby. And on January 26, 1825, after 7 months in the death prison, Adoniram received a note that said, Maria Elizabeth Butterworth Judson, born today. Thank God we are both alive. Love, Ann. A daughter. Joy and sorrow filled Adoniram. He was so thankful that his precious wife and newborn daughter were healthy, but he was brokenhearted, not knowing if he would ever be able to love and care for his baby daughter outside of this prison. Soon after, new orders came from the guards that all the foreign prisoners were going to be moved back into that gross, awful inside cell. And they were separated from the small relief that they had from the huts. Now, little did they know this was actually trying to protect them, because all the while, Anne had been pleading with her friend, the governor, please free my husband, please help us. But the order came from the king, so the governor could not free him, but he was going to try to help him. By putting Adoniram back into the dark cell, he hoped the king might forget about him. And in May, more change came. After 11 months of suffering, the guards shouted that the prisoners would be getting up and moving out to a new location. By now, Adoniram was sick with a fever, and he was weak, and he could barely even stand. But they were forced to walk miles down a brick road. Heated by the sun, those bricks felt like they were from an oven, and every step made their feet blister, and it hurt, and every single step was painful. But eventually they arrived at the new prison, and somehow Anne was there again. She traveled through rough and dangerous roads, carrying baby Maria, determined to find him. And when Adoniram saw them, he was so weak that he thought it was a dream. But when he realized it was real and she was really there, he whispered, "Why have you come? I hoped you would not follow me here to watch me die. You cannot stay." But she stayed. And this new prison was similar to the old one in that it still had that giant bamboo pole stretched across, and every night they still had their legs lifted up high. But this prison was more run down. The roof was broken, there was air inside. This prison was also near some rice paddies, and now the prisoners had a new enemy, mosquitoes. Adoniram woke up to mosquitoes feasting on his burned and blistered feet, and the pole that had their ankles up high was too far away for them to even swat the enemies away. The next day, another friend arrived with some cold rice and curry, and Anne also confessed that this was the first time she had eaten in 2 days as well. Anne was staying nearby the prison in an old storage room for grain. It was gross. It was filthy. There was no furniture, no worldly comforts of any kind, not even a chair. Just dirt and hunger and exhaustion. She was caring for her baby Maria. She was also caring for 2 Burmese girls that were traveling with her. And then she was continually pouring herself out, caring for Adoniram and the other foreign prisoners. She was always seeking to meet the needs of others. But at this time, one of the Burmese girls caught smallpox, which is a painful and at that time often a deadly disease. And even baby Maria caught it, and she had sores all over her tiny body. Anne was able to survive the smallpox and care for everyone around her, and the children even all recovered. But a short time after, Anne became desperately sick with a deadly jungle illness. And her sickness grew so severe that she nearly died. And at one point, she was so weak she could barely move. She couldn't care for her baby. She couldn't care for the Burmese girls or for her husband. At a later time, she wrote about this, saying, "To be confined to sickness and unable to help those who were so dear to me in their distress was almost too much for me to bear. Had it not been for my faith and the assured conviction that every additional trial was ordered by infinite love and mercy, I would have sunk under my suffering." She trusted that God was always in control of everything and that he was still good even in their misery because the gospel was still true. Even in her deepest distress, God had not abandoned her, and she was resolved to trust in him and follow him every breath she had. Meanwhile, Adoniram continued to endure prison suffering. By God's kindness, he recovered from his fever. But then he thought he was going crazy because he was hearing things. He thought he was hearing roaring. But it turns out he wasn't hearing things. A lion was brought into the camp in a large cage. And all the foreign prisoners thought, well, this is it. They're going to feed us to the lion. This is the end. But the lion was very terrifying to everyone, including the prison guards. Nobody went near the lion. Nobody fed the lion. The lion died of starvation in the cage. So the guards took the lion away, but afterwards Adoniram asked if he could sleep in the lion's cage. And for the first time in almost a year, Adoniram was able to sleep with his legs on the ground. By August, there was more news of the war. The British were winning. And soon, officials rushed in and ordered that all the foreign prisoners be taken to a new city. The king needed help to translate the treaty to end the war between Burma and Britain. Adoniram, Anne, and Henry were the only men in the entire country that were able to help the king with this treaty. For months, Adoniram and Henry worked between the two sides until finally in November the treaty was complete. And after more than a year in chains, Adoniram was given his freedom. The British also needed Adoniram's help with translations, and so they sent for the Judsons. As they traveled down the Irrawaddy River on a moonlit sky, Adoniram held his baby in their arms. And his health and his body were almost destroyed, but in this boat, he finally felt peace, and his heart was full of gratitude, and he was so thankful for his freedom. Soon after, one of Adoniram's Burmese Christian friends shared an incredible story. The man had visited the old death prison in hopes of just finding something to remember Adoniram by. But all he could find was this gross, ugly pillow. Well, he took the pillow home and he was going to clean it, but when he opened it, he found all of Adoniram's Bible translations. The work that Adoniram had been doing for years had been rescued, and it was perfectly preserved. After this, the Judson family moved to Amherst, a British-controlled area of Burma. And shortly after, the East India Company asked Adoniram to come and help them with translation work for trade agreements. Now, at first, Adoniram refused. He was finally home. He wanted to spend time with his family. He wanted to continue his missionary work. But the East India Company made an offer that caught his attention. They promised if he would help them, that they would try to persuade the Burmese government to allow religious freedom throughout the country. This would give Burmese citizens the freedom to be a Christian without any persecution. They would be able to freely share the gospel, to openly worship God, and to publicly hold baptisms. Anne and Adoniram agreed that this was worth it. Anne and Adoniram said goodbye, praying that this trip would open the door to the gospel being spread freely in Burma. Throughout the months, Adoniram received letters from Anne, and many of them contained troubling news. Baby Maria was not doing well. She was often sick, she was frequently very weak, and then one day, Adoniram received a letter with a black seal. Usually, this meant that the letter contained news of death. So heartbroken, he started to open it, expecting to see that baby Maria probably died. But to his great shock and disbelief, he read, to sum up the unhappy tidings in a few words, Mrs. Judson is no more. It wasn't Maria, it was Anne, his devoted wife and best friend in all the world. She had died. She simply caught a fever, but her body had been through so much illness previously that she couldn't overcome it. 2 months later, Adoniram's work for the East India Company was finished, and he was free to return home. But the final treaty did not even include anything about religious freedom. The trip home was sad and lonely. And upon arriving home, almost 2-year-old Maria didn't even recognize her daddy. And even still, Adoniram continued to care for his daughter, continued to work on his Bible translations. But unfortunately, baby Maria never recovered from her illnesses and weakness. And 6 months to the day after Anne's death, little Maria died too. And she was buried besides her mother underneath a hope tree on the shores of Burma. Adoniram found himself in a deep valley of suffering. Death is so sad, but even still, we are not without hope. God's word says that everyone who turns away from their sin and puts their faith in Jesus Christ as their Savior will be saved. That Anne, though she had died on earth, was now in perfect peace and everlasting life in heaven with God. And so God has finished his plan for Anne on earth, but still has some amazing plans for Adoniram in the future, which you get to find out more tomorrow. Ah, good job.